Alright, in today's video we're going to make a new tote and knob for this old number 4 that I bought and I've disassembled here. We're going to make the tote and knobs to match my other number 4 and my number 5 here. When you buy these used, a lot of times you'll see the horn is broken off of the tote, which doesn't really affect use, but it kind of looks shabby. And this one's actually been broken clean in half at some point in the past. I don't know if it shows up in the video, but it's been broken and re-glued. So we're going to make a new one of those. And the knob is actually in decent shape, but we're going to make it so a new one so it'll match the tote. Alright, so let's get started. The first thing you're going to want to do is go to Lee Valley's website, where they've been kind enough to provide this free set of plans. When you print them, make sure you unclick the fit to page option on your printer, and you'll know you've got it right when these calibration inches are actually an inch. You just need a piece of wood that's at least 4 5/8 inches wide by 4 3/8 inches long, and they recommend 15/16 as the thickness that you plane your wood down to before you started. Now I've always found plane handles to be a little bit skinny, so I planed mine down to about an inch. This is what, 5 thou under, and it just makes a slightly beefier handle, which I think fits a little better. What I'm using here is crabapple from a tree that I had to cut down a few summers ago because it had carpenter ants. I think it's going to be a pretty attractive handle, and it matches the handles I've already made. You can use any kind of wood you want, of course, but a tight-grained wood is best. I probably wouldn't make it out of oak, but if you had maple, I think beech and apple are both kind of traditional choices. Or if you want to be fancy, get a figured wood and have it be real pretty. But I'm just using this scrap piece of crabapple. Mine does have a crack here in it, so I'm going to position the handle to make sure that I don't get that crack in the... You can see it on the end there. I'm going to position it so that crack doesn't obviously appear on the handle itself. Alright, I've cut my pattern out, but before I attach it, I wanted to say something about cutting the pattern in your blank. The most important thing on this is that this angle formed between the screw, the hole that you're going to drill for the screw, and the bottom of your tote here. If that's off, then the screw is not going to be able to seat properly in your plane, or you're going to have a big gap on the bottom or something like that, and it's going to be all messed up. So it's critical when you cut your pattern out that you cut it right on that dotted line, and when you attach it to the pattern that it's right on the bottom of your blank, because when you set that on your drill press you need it to be perfectly straight. It's also important that the sides here of your blank are perfectly parallel to each other, unless you have just a really long drill bit where you can drill all the way through here. When I do it, I'm going to have to drill it halfway down on one side and then flip it over and drill it halfway down on the other side. So when I set this on the drill press table, if those sides aren't parallel, then I'm going to drill kind of an angled hole here. So just make sure that you've got parallel ends, and also that the ends are nice and square to the sides. That way it's not sitting on your drill press table, crooked like this, where you're drilling a crooked hole. So just be aware of those things, and when you're attaching your pattern, make sure that you get it lined up nice with the bottom. I've got my pattern positioned on the blank where I want it. I've made a mark on the center line of this hole on the top and the bottom. Now I want to center where I'm going to drill. So I measure the thickness of my blank, which is again about a little less than 1/100 under an inch. I'm going to bring this in, bring my calipers in about half that. Oops. Right there, so I'm going to set my marking gauge to that depth, and then make a mark, and I'll just do from both sides. Okay, and I'm just going to bring my square over And now I've got the location for the hole for the mounting screw. Drill the hole for this long bolt. The plans call for a 7/16 hole, which is just over 11 millimeters. I don't have a 7/16 drill bit or an 11 millimeter drill bit, so I had a choice between a 27/64 or a 10.5 millimeter, and I went with the 27/64. It's going to be a little loose, but as you can see, my bolt, I'm not sure how well it shows, but my bolt is old and rusty and kind of bent, so it's not going to go in straight, so a little looseness might actually help it drive in better. The other thing you want to keep in mind is how deep you're going to drill this hole. It's about 12 millimeters, and also keep in mind that when you put it on, if this is the shape of your plan, that your 12 millimeters needs to start a little bit below, because this above part here is going to be sanded off when you shape the top of the handle. So figure out how deep you need to cut it, set your depth stop, and then we're going to drill our hole. The plans call for this hole to be a 5/16. I think that's a little bigger than you need. This is only about a 3/16 bolt here. So, you know, I'm not using a 5/16, even though it's actually been out of shape. I'm using a 7 millimeter. We're going to drill that hole as deep as I can get it on one side. We're going to flip it over the other side, drill it from the bottom, and then we'll see how accurate my marking was and how square my edges were. Alright, I've flipped the blank over and we're going to come in from the other side. Alright, it's kind of hard to show it on the camera here, but you can see that the hole does line up nicely, so it's nice when that works out, huh? Now the best practice here would probably be to use a spray adhesive or double-sided tape to permanently attach your pattern. That way you didn't have to constantly be adjusting it. I don't have spray adhesive or double stick tape, so what I've done is just made some marks so that it's easy to put the pattern off and back on the wood. So I've got it back in its original location, and what I'm going to do now is mark the locations for these holes and then go to my drill press and drill them out. As you can see, that I've taped the pattern back on my blank. I got my marks lined back up, so I'm going to go ahead and cut it out. I'm not going to cut it on the bottom at this time or on the top, just because I think when I use the router to round it over, those pieces would be a little thin. I don't want to risk breaking them. So I'm just going to cut out this side and this side right now. Okay, once you've got it advanced onto the rough shape, then use whatever method you want to sand it down to the line. I've got this little drum sanding attachment for my drill press that I'm going to use. If you have a spindle sander, that'd probably be the best, easiest tool. But whatever method you're going to use, you need to get it down to the line. Okay, unfortunately, my drum sander on the drill press isn't quite tall enough for this thickness of wood, and you can see there's a little nub on the bottom here that didn't get sanded. So I'm just going to use the flush trim bit and my router table and even it up. Alright, now that I've got this flushed up, I'm going to use a roundover bit in my router table in order to start the shaping process. The biggest roundover bit I have is a 3/8 inch. This is a 1-inch thick blank, so it's not going to do the whole job, but I don't have a larger one, so we're going to have to use the file after this. Notice that the top is still not shaped and it doesn't get rounded over, and obviously neither does the bottom. So right now we're just going to do the sides. As you can see, I've taken the pattern back off. I've finished using the round over bit. It's burned the edges, but that doesn't matter because we're going to file off all that anyway. You can just see that my round over bit is not big enough to completely round over and make a bullnose on these. So I'm just going to use files and sandpaper and probably about half an hour of elbow grease. I've just clamped it to my bench, and I'm going to work this into a bullnose on all the edges that we've used the round over on. I've got a tiny little crack here where there's a knot in the wood, so I'm just going to put a drop of CA in there. And that should seal that right up. Okay, we've sanded it to 220. I've got the bullnose profile, I'm not sure how well that's shown up on camera, that I wanted. I've reattached the schematic, lining up the marks that I made originally, and now I'm going to cut the top off and then sand it flush. Alright, the top is cut on the bandsaw. Now I'm going to use the sanding disc that I've attached to my lathe to smooth it up. Now the front is not supposed to be squared off like this, so we're also going to use the sanding disc to round that over. Okay, now the reason that we've left the bottom flat is that now we can do a final test on the hole here and make sure it fits. I want the brass piece to protrude just slightly out of the top. So mine is about where I want it. If that first hole that you drilled was too shallow, then we've still got the base square, so you could put it on your drill press and make it a little deeper if you needed to, but that's right about where I want it to be. So now we can take this back over to the bandsaw and cut the bottom. Alright, so this is a pretty important one. Hopefully you haven't moved your pattern. You've got it taped down real good, because this sanding here is going to establish the angle between that initial hole that you drilled and the bottom of your tote, and that's going to determine whether your tote is going to sit flush with the bottom of the plane body when you've got the screws tightened in. Right, now that you've got the bottom sanded flush, you need to drill 2 holes. The first hole is to account for this little thing here, which is where the screw attaches. You just need to drill a hole in the bottom of your tote to countersink that, and that's what's depicted here. And then the second hole is for this little pin. In the bigger Stanley planes, the 5s and ups, that hole would go all the way through your tote, and then there'd be a screw here. But on the little ones, on this number 4, it's just going to be a little divot. So we're just going to measure the size of this thing, and we got, what, 14 millimeters, and we're going to move over to the drill press and countersink that hole. Okay, it's a little hard to drill this hole because you've already got the hole going all the way through here, so it's a little difficult to get this one started. Plus, you don't have the flat surface on the bottom anymore, so I just wrapped mine in some cloth to protect that curved surface that we've already sanded. I'm going to hold it vertically and just take the cut nice and slow and just see how this works out. Alright, now that we've got that countersink drilled, we can just set it over the spot, and I'm just going to kind of press down really hard on the tote and try to get that pivot point to make an indent in the bottom of my tote so I'll know just where to drill. So you just want to make sure you've got it nice and straight, and then kind of press down. And then there we have a nice mark where we need to drill the hole. I've set my calipers to half of the thickness of my tote. I used it to set my marking gauge, and now I'm just going to make marks on the halfway point just so I know exactly where to drill. Alright, I used my calipers to figure out the size of that pin. It's a 3/16. I've used my awl to make a divot where I want to start that hole at, and I'm ready to drill the hole for that pin. Okay, once you've got those holes drilled, I actually think I might have measured wrong. That pin is kind of tapered, so I ended up getting a needle file and kind of rounding out the bottom of that hole. After I did that, I thought about it, and it probably would be easier just to use a countersink bit to widen it out a little bit, but just work on it till you've got it fitting nice. Get the sandpaper over the top here and these edges that you rounded over on the top and the bottom. And once you've got it like you'd like it here, give it a test fit, and if it works, you're ready to put the stain on. Alright, here you can see the difference between the knobs on my number 5 and my other number 4. The 5 is taller and narrower, and the 4 is a little fatter. I use my calipers on the, what I believe is the original that came off of the one we're working on here, and it says the widest part is 1.81 inches, so just over 1.75 inches. The narrowest part down here at the bottom is right on 1.25 inches. So just make sure whatever turning stock you have is big enough to do about 1.75 inches size knob. Now I don't believe there are any super critical width measurements on the number 4. The number 5 at the bottom here, you can see it kind of sits inside of this metal circle, so you have to kind of size the bottom part of it right, but the number 4 just sits flat on the base of the thing. Now the height has to be right so that your screw will fit, but other than that, you just can kind of fit it to shape your hand. Now I'm trying to match as closely as possible the one that I took off of this plane, so I'm going to try to shape mine just like this one. So to start that, you can see I've already got the length done. The bottom part here is roughed to 1.25 inches, and the outside diameter here is the 1.8, whatever it was on the calipers. So all I have left to do now is finish shaping it till it looks like that, and we can start putting the finish on. Okay, as you can see, the knob is pretty much finished, sanded to 400 grit, and then finished with Watco Danish oil in a medium walnut color. I don't know if that actually penetrates the surface and protects it at all, but I like this color. As you can see on the end, even though I'm using the chuck, we went ahead and used the tailstock to make a divot. So we have a divot right in the center, which will guide for the drill when we drill for the screw to hold it on. Next step is just going to be to take it out of the chuck. I'm just going to leave it on here, but take it out of the chuck, put a few coats of lacquer on it, sanding in between coats. After letting the last coat of lacquer cure overnight, I'm going to give it a few coats of wax and buff it with some 4/0 steel wool. And we're now ready finally to part off the knob. Okay, the procedure here is the same as it was on the Tote. I used my calipers to measure the size of the head of the bolt here. It was 7/16. The closest drill bit I have to 7/16 is 15/32, so that's what I'm going to use. I measured the depth that I wanted to recess it, and it's about 12 millimeters on mine. So I'm just going to drill a 12 millimeter deep hole. Okay, the post here is about 17/32, so I've selected the drill bit I'm going to use to drill that hole, but you can barely see that they've welded this post onto the plane, and there's a little bit of the weld still left around the bottom. So if you just drilled your hole the size of this post, it wouldn't sit down flush. And you can see on the original that they've kind of rounded out the hole. So we're going to do something similar on this one. So I've just mounted up a 3/4 inch Forstner bit, and I'm just going to drill a very shallow hole in the bottom of this to account for the weld, and then we'll switch drill bits out and drill the hole to allow for the post. So just about that much. Okay, the depth of the post here is about 9 millimeters. So that's how deep we're going to drill. Okay, finally we're going to chuck the drill bit in we're going to use to drill the through hole. I forgot to mention earlier, the reason that we drill the top hole first is because if you try to drill the bottom hole, when it's still rounded, it would kind of wobble around, but once you've got that top countersink done, it sits nicely. So we've got the drill bit chucked, ready to drill the through hole. My cameraman just went to baseball practice, so I'm not going to show this one. The last thing I do is to chuck the bolts themselves into my drill press and give the top a little bit of a polish, because I figure if you're going to have pretty new totes and handles, you might as well have a shiny bolt to go with it. One last thing I wanted to say about the fit of your tote and your knob. Here's the original, and if you look at it, you can see it's got a lot of wobble in it, and I kind of wonder if that may have contributed to my bolt being all bent like I showed you earlier. So when I make mine, I try to make it so you can see there's no wobble in it at all. And if you build one and there is a little wobble, you could put, you know, wood putty or epoxy or something on whichever side you needed it. That way, because when you're operating the plane, you know, all of your forward pressure is basically coming from the contact of the tote on this little, I don't know what the technical word for it is, but this little welded on piece right here. So, you know, I want to have a tight fit on that. But anyway, we're ready to bolt this down and put the plane back together. Alright, and this is the finished product. You know, it didn't turn out perfect. I accidentally countersunk the knob for the tote a little too deeply, and I got a little wobbly when I was drilling the countersink hole on this one, but you know, overall pretty good. As soon as I get this lever cap replaced with one that isn't broken in half, I think this plane's going to start working really well. One last thing to check is that when you tighten the bolt down on the tote, that the bottom is still sitting flush with the plane. When I made this one, I didn't get the angle quite right on my hole versus the base, and it was kind of sitting up, so I had to sand down on the heel of the tote, but it wasn't that big a deal, so just make sure it sits flush. I hope you enjoyed this video. It's my first try at a woodworking video on YouTube, so click like if you enjoyed it, and good luck on your own tote.